We are taking a look at where Youngwood started. This is where Depot Street goes across the tracks. And before there was even a town here, there was a railroad station here. In the 1870s, there was a railroad station that predated the one we're looking at here. It was at least, I know I can see it on mapping, in 1876. Now this building here, this large building behind the trees, is possibly the oldest building in Youngwood. But I don't know that for certain. I know that most of the buildings around here were built around 1902. That's the date of that station. In 1901, by the end of 1901, there were 75 buildings, 75 houses that had been built. But this old, large brick building was built in 1890 as a store, and it became a post office too. In 1916, the railroad bought it and made it a Railroad YMCA because they needed a lot of space for people to, not just visitors, people traveling, but their own crew. They had to crew a lot of trains here, and some guys would be laying over for a run the next day, and they'd need a place to stay. A guy named Robert Ellis owned this big building, and it's been there quite a while. And the old station still stays there. Speaking of better days, when a lot of people and freight went through this area. And we have a caboose up there to remind us of days like that when the old steamers puffed up through here, chugging their loads of coal and coke up into the classification yards, where they'd be put together as trains, where they'd be taken up to the main line in Greensburg and sent out to parts beyond. This is a drawing of the station at Youngwood that I did maybe in the 90s. It's just a kind of a quick impression of the place, drawn with ink and have a little color on it. This is looking north down there on a snowy day, maybe around the year 2000. You can see a bit of activity going on up in the yard then. Buncher Company was doing some things up there, repairing cars. This is on a nicer day. They were running an excursion train, bringing an old steam engine up into Youngwood and taking cars full of people out for a ride. This is stopped at the station there, taking on passengers. I think that was a good idea. That was one of those days. You see a lot of people there having a good time. This I put in because it's a shot of a roundhouse, a partial roundhouse, as there was, similar to what there was at Youngwood. Repeat, this is not the roundhouse at Youngwood. I just wanted to put it in here to show you what it looked like. And in the foreground here is a turntable. This turntable you could pull an engine onto, and it would spin around here, and it would route it to whatever bay you wanted to put the engine into. These tracks are a little bit smaller than the regular gauge. Regular gauge is about 4 foot 8.5 inches, and this is the smaller gauge, which is around a yard. This, we're looking over the the passenger station itself, and we see this big looming building behind it, which was very possibly the first building in Youngwood, because it was built in 1890, about 12 years before the station was built. And most buildings in Youngwood were around 1900 or after. It was around that time that the classification yard was built, and there was a need for a lot of housing for people to live there and work there, crew the trains and all that. It was a real It was a railroad town. Now here is a view from 1927. What we're looking at here is Depot Street. This here is the station itself. Across the street was once a two-story, calls it an office. I think this was also the control tower for the yards. Somebody could fill me in on that if they have better information. And right behind the station itself was that big old building that I said dates from about 1890. It's noted here as a Railroad YMCA. And it was, starting in 1916, it was a YMCA used for largely for railroad workers who needed to stay there between going out on trips, and for whatever passengers might be passing through and needed a place to stay. That's that very building. That is a really recent photo. I just did that last Sunday, the 28th of January. And it has been added to, this is obviously an addition. This used to be a storefront. This was originally the property of a fellow named Robert Ellis. And he lived upstairs and had a store downstairs. And he also was a postmaster. That was before there was even a town there. And by 1916, the railroad bought it then and turned it into a YMCA because they needed housing. And the next thing we see should be a trip up into the yard going north. We are up here in what was once the classification yard at Youngwood. The cars were taken to a place where they would roll into position. It's hard to imagine the amount of activity that took place here once upon a time. There was an awful lot of coal and coke that came into here from the south, down in Fayette County, and then was arranged here into the trains that they would need to take to various places. Probably a lot went to Pittsburgh. This is what's left, what we can see of the classification yard here. It was wider and longer than we can see, but it was one time a very, very busy place. In fact, I remember hearing stories of how they sometimes, on a cold, dark night, would not have enough guys to crew a train, and so the dispatcher would get on to Youngwood and go looking through the bars to find railroad men, and he would drag them out of the bars and bring them up here and put them on a crew that would go out on the railroad. Some of them probably in very dubious condition. And we'll swing around here. That's the train station in Youngwood, and we're looking south here where Depot Street in Youngwood goes across the railroad. It just looks like a place that has seen better times at this point, but it was once a very up-and-coming enterprise.